And we're live, and I thought I'd introduce it like this with a cunning zoom out to see what's going on.
I wondered what that was.
Yeah. A world of difference. Right then, the
first thing I'd say about this is I don't think that's a very good title for what happens in the episode. But anyway,
Yeah.
I'll let you go with it.
Yeah. Yeah, written by Richard Matheson. I think he wrote some Star Trek stories. I'm not quite sure. I think it was Charles Beaumont that died young. I'll try and do the Rod Serling voice, unless Jeff, you want to do it.
You're looking at a tableau of reality, things of substance, of physical material, a desk, a window, a light. These things exist and have dimension. Now this is Arthur Curtis, age 36, who is also real. Take note of that, ladies and gentlemen, that Rod Serling, the godfather of the show, is telling you that he's real. Okay, remember that later. He has flesh and blood, muscle and mind. But in just a moment, we will see how thin a line separates that which we assume to be real with that manufactured inside of a mind.
Yeah. It's interesting that he put inside of a mind rather than inside of his mind.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so businessman Arthur Curtis is surprised to find the phone in his office dead. He's even more surprised when he hears a voice behind him shout "cut" and turns to see that his office is actually a set on a soundstage. What's more, everyone on this set insists that Curtis is actually Jerry Reagan, a drunken movie star on the decline, and that Arthur Curtis is the character Reagan plays in the movie. Determined to assert his identity, Curtis commandeers the car of Reagan's shrewish ex-wife and drives to where his home should be. There, he finds no trace of his wife or daughter or his house, or even the street they live on. Later, at Jerry Reagan's house, Curtis calls information for the number of the company he's worked at for the past 7 years. No listing. Thinking his client is having a nervous breakdown, Reagan's agent tries to reassure him, telling him he needn't return to the picture and that the studio has cancelled the production. The sets are being dismantled. Realizing that the only fragile link to his world, the office set, is about to be destroyed, Curtis races to the studio. Just in time, he dashes onto the set and pleads with some unseen force not to maroon him in this uncaring place. The sounds of studio hustle and bustle fade away. Curtis finds himself back in the office he knew, complete with 4 solid walls. Meanwhile, the agent arrives on the soundstage and finds that Jerry Reagan is nowhere to be found. Right there. So, Jeff, do you want to do the outro or should I do it?
The modus operandi for the departure from life is usually a pine box of such and such dimensions, and this is the ultimate in reality. But there are other ways for a man to exit from life. Take the case of Arthur Curtis, age 36. His departure was along a highway with an exit sign that reads, "This way to escape." Arthur Curtis, en route to the Twilight Zone.
Jeff, what do you think of the episode?
Well, I'm actually going to let you go first because before I watched it, you said something about this is OMG or something. So I want you, now that I've seen it, to explain what you meant by that.
Well, what happened was, it was my reaction to that initial bit. You know, where he turns around and he finds himself on a set.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of spoke too soon. And it was like what I imagined would happen. It was the OMG based on the premise.
Oh, so you hadn't seen the rest of the episode when you?
No, I jumped the gun. I did that intuitive thing of jumping to conclusions.
Well, I would say first, I'll get the flaws out of the way first.
Yeah.
It is a bit repetitive. with the number of times and people that he's saying I'm not Jerry, and uh, but I mean, obviously there was a reason for that and reinforcing the concept, but there were still moments where I was like, okay, we get it, move on. um, and the they could have cast somebody better to play the little girl, or just drop her lines entirely because she sounded just goofy. But other than that, I thought it was really well done, and I recognized the guy. I guess was supposed to be like his agent or something. He's the it's from one of those '60s shows. I remember, was I Dream of Jeannie or Bewitched or whatever. Maybe
Yes.
both of them. I don't know.
Yes, I Dream of Jeannie, the boss of J.R.
Yeah.
Ewing.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's who he was. Yeah.
Now we got him.
I knew I recognized him. But I like the fact that in this one the twist is that he was real all along. But he said the way he has it at the end is like, he exited as an escape, but it doesn't really explain that part. So it's like, okay, again, it's kind of left ambiguous. But as I've established, I sort of like that. And so they don't tell you what this other side thing, what the thing about the movie really was, whether it was just like a daydream he had, or whether he really, some other kind of thing happened. But to sort of like reinforce or like make him thankful for what he has in life or whatever. But that's the kind of thing that, as we've discussed before, some producers or writers that had more of an agenda or just trying to hit you over the head with like some sort of emotional thing would have tried to have that stuff explained or focused on, and this kind of leaves it up to interpretation. So that I think is cool, that it's like he tells you right off that this guy is real. So it's not just that you're feeling for him discovering this other thing, it's that you are right there with him in terms of every time he says, stop calling me Jerry. You're like, it really feels like I'm like, yeah, stop calling him Jerry, but what I mentioned last week is because of the kind of weak links in the cast, as well as like some of the stuff, the way that they did it, the tension wasn't like mounted properly as the episode went on. Whereas in this episode, I think they did a good job of holding the tension throughout. Even if, like I said, there were a few bits that were just kind of repetitive, but it's kind of one of those things. Like, again, I've said there's several episodes like this where if you really examine it, you're like, well, what was the point of this? And then you just have to say, well, there really isn't one, other than, like I said, if they're kind of trying to give the idea of he needed this to sort of remind him what, to be thankful for what he had, but it's possible he already did anyway. So it seemed like it that he was. So anyway, that's my sort of rambling thoughts on that. But
yeah, I've got some information later in the book that says that continuous shot, that set, they slid it across in order to reveal the people behind it.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I have other thoughts on this, but I'll let you say, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, I'll come back to that technical stuff after we've gone through the slides. What after you said your thoughts, we could then discuss about. It's interesting that after the episodes we've seen so far, it's interesting in terms of the things that they stress too much, and then the things that they don't stress, and how you said there that you like sometimes that they don't stress certain things. So it's like knowing what to stress and what not to stress.
I like it when they don't hit you over the head with, this is what you're supposed to feel about this, or this is the lesson, or whatever. And as we mentioned before, like last week's episode was kind of really the first time where it seemed like there was this, very strong, this is the message I'm trying to get across kind of attitude. And I didn't say that in itself was a problem. if it was well done enough, I just thought, well, you can go back and listen to last week's if you want to hear my thoughts on that. But if it could have been done more effectively, but probably if week after week that was the way that the show was, I wouldn't like it as much.
Yeah.
Because it would get kind of old to do things that way. So I like the fact that most of them aren't like that. That they kind of let you interpret or get your own lessons from it.
I judge television programs by the era they were made in, and sort of like what the audience would have experienced before. And us watching it now, I mean, even people in the 1990s, they had this wealth of experience of other TV series, whereas people watching this at the time, they would not have had much experience of this kind of television because television was so young. And maybe only if they'd read a lot of those short stories where they have a twist at the end in like Astounding Stories, those kind of things. And so, because this was such a risk, I think that's part of the context of where they overstress the premise on certain things too much. Like, it's general trend to do it at least once too much in terms of stressing the premise. Also, that may have actually been more understandable later on, when people are changing between channels. But at this point, channel clickers hadn't even been invented, unless maybe they had some on a wire where people were switching between channels. So playing it safe with the
well,
premise.
You had less channels to switch to, but you still obviously could do it.
Yeah.
I don't happen to know off the top of my head what their competition was at that time, but on the other networks. But it would have been at least 2 other shows on.
I'll put it like this, Jeff. Do you think they stress it too much? The premise? Do they too much, even for the 1950s SJs?
I don't have enough information to answer that question.
Right. Because you've got experience of SJs, I just wonder how many times do they need a sort of like, because I'm thinking from the point of view of they've never seen a program like this before.
If you're asking me, do I think it's like dumbed down too much? Then no. Overall, I don't have that feeling.
No.
When I said it was repetitive, I guess you could interpret that as kind of stressing the premise too much. But to me, I don't really think of it that way. I just think it's in the allotted time you have.
Yeah.
You could probably cut some of that and still maintain the story and the tension, everything fine.
Yeah.
So it hits me like a little bit as kind of filler when certain things are repeated too much.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's in a like insulting to the audience kind of way, or like, you're too dumb to get this kind of thing. I don't feel that way about it.
Yeah, because he had to write a lot of episodes because that was part of his deal. That he had to write about 3/4 of the scripts in the first season, because he only really got this series because he wasn't already an award-winning writer, and they believed in him. They didn't believe in the show; they believed in him as a writer, and so they wanted most of the episodes written by him, and in return, he got to be able to produce it himself with his own Cayuga. That's it, Cayuga Productions.
Mm-hmm.
And
I feel like one of the cool things about Twilight Zone is it makes me kind of have that feeling of putting myself in the particular situation and what would I do, and when there's possibilities for that, it makes me enjoy it more. So I felt a little bit of that in this episode, so not as much as a few other ones.
Yeah.
So I didn't enjoy it quite as much as
the four of us are dying.
Yeah, that one. There were certain elements of this that reminded me of Time Enough at Last, which overall is my favorite so far. Just in sort of that kind of desperation thing, which we've had in several episodes, where it's kind of like the one guy who nobody believes what he's saying kind of thing, and he's kind of off on his own, having to deal with like what's left of it. So that even just that scene where he goes back to the office, back to the set, reminded me a little bit of that one. But there was something else I was going to say. But yeah, I started sort of imagining, myself in that situation in terms of, and obviously I think I would act very differently than him because the character himself, as again, I don't do as much of the drive-by typing as you do when it comes to short characters, but the way he's presented, he is very guardian-ish in terms of like he's everything is kind of he's this family man. Everything needs to be normal and understandable to him. So anything that like is foreign to him is causing him to have this kind of breakdown feeling. Whereas for me, of course, I immediately think of what kind of fun can I have in this fictional world I'm suddenly in.
Yeah.
So that strikes me as a sort of a temperament difference in terms of the way I approach it. But I also, if I don't feel entirely wrapped up in the story, if I feel like I'm sort of examining it from a critical eye while I'm watching it, I don't enjoy it quite as much. I try
Right.
not to do that, but it sometimes just happens naturally where I'm taken out of it. And this was one of those times where I felt like, and I'm not blaming you, so don't take it that way. But your comment, even just the little comment you made before, made me sort of have this. It's not something intentional, but it's sort of my brain just does that thing where it's like, I'm going to find the flaws in this because it sounds like Ben really thought it was some amazing thing. And that's not, like I said, it's
Yeah.
not intentional. It's just, it happens automatically, like subconsciously. And I actually try to repress that. Sometimes
Right.
it just happens too strong. But so I'm glad that it ended up being a good episode, despite that, so that I wasn't questioning whether or not I was like thinking of it as lousy just because of that, because I don't like doing that.
Yeah.
But it did actually make me start sort of doing a little bit of daydreaming of, writing my own kind of story with a similar concept in some ways. Not exactly the same way, but sort of, again, something that's not entirely original, but an idea of someone sort of creating a fictional world that becomes reality, or at least people think it is, that kind of thing, which I know has been done many times in different ways, but I feel like I could come up with ways to make it fresh that it wouldn't feel like it was just a rehashing.
Yeah. I suppose.
The other immediate thing I was thinking of as soon as they did it was the set thing was the Truman Show, which I really enjoy that movie. But obviously, and it's not the only example of something like that, but that was my first thought, is it's going to be like he's just living his life, but people are observing it as if it was a TV show or a movie. But then they quickly established that that's not the case based on what everybody says. So, but that was my first thought, is it was something like that.
I suppose the interesting thing about with these stories where it is somebody living in a fantasy world is how to engineer a situation where what happens in the fantasy matters, has consequences, and then there's suspense to it.
Yeah, well, obviously the idea behind this one was that that it was backwards in terms of the fantasy was what we were led to believe. It's like it's a double twist, but the double twist is that the original statements are correct, and then the original description of the man, like, he's not lying to you about this guy being a real person. And so the fantasy is what happens in between. We just don't know why, because he never really says that.
But also, they have the name of the script at the end, where it says something like the imaginary life of, I think it's here, the private world of Arthur Curtis. Yeah. So it's almost that could be the script to the episode that we're watching.
Yeah, and we don't know whether or not that's just like, so again, something he's imagining, or if it's somebody else, and he doesn't say, which is fine. He doesn't have to say.
Yeah.
Um, but I like that in terms of, uh, it's not like you were saying. Definitely at that time, stories like that I don't think were very common on television,
Yeah.
or even in movies, because usually if you had something where the concept is somebody's life is not what they thought it was or something, that would be held, throughout the whole thing, as opposed to establishing right off the bat that this is not just a character, it's a real person. So um,
It's,
I think it could be enjoyed on different levels because of that.
it's
So I think, maybe the more kind of NF fantasy types who like to, daydream about fictional worlds and stuff like that can take it in in more directions if they want to, and it's open to doing that. And the people that are more like factual can just take it for the matter of fact things that he says and not worry about the other stuff. So
yeah.
I think there's a lot of freedom in that, which of course appeals to me.
It's how to give the fantasy world some significance where maybe something can be learnt from it. Because to me, it's a disappointing ending to the Wizard of Oz, where she was just having a dream.
Yeah, I agree about that.
Because because then it's like, it was just a dream. There's no significance to the events. What I did like about that was the fact that in the story of the Wizard of Oz, the 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 characters that really desired something actually showed those things before they were given the sort of prizes at the end by the Wizard of Oz. So, for instance, you had the straw man that didn't have a brain. He kept on being resourceful and coming up with clever ideas throughout the plot. And so it was almost as if those things can come through in the character development, and then they get awarded those things at the end. And then there's this idea that the straw man suddenly has a brain because he can do all these formulas and things in his head. Whereas throughout the plot, he'd shown his like tactical intelligence in getting things done. So that
Yeah,
bit was
and
meaningful, but
that that's why Kersey cited that, and Please Understand Me Too, as a as an example of the four temperament model, because he was talking about how each one of them, the thing that they supposedly thought they didn't have enough of, was what they demonstrated they already had, what their strength already was.
yep,
And so, it's just a recurring theme about humans is, be, they tend to, the other thing he said, in the book, was that they tend to practice what their instincts tell them to, and so they tend to be better at what they already were good at to start with, as opposed to developing other things as much.
yeah,
And so that's a funny thing when I see in like type communities people asking questions about like how do I better develop my inferior functions, or questions like that. And my response is always, just live your life. Because life experience, it just happens naturally that you know you you sort of have experiences that shore up things, but that for whatever reason, there's a reason why there's things you're good at, and it sort of is filling these roles in society. It doesn't have to be quite as rigid as some people might imagine it. But it's still, there's a reason why that you're good at these things, and you fill that role and you provide those things to other people that don't have those things. So rather than spend your time trying to say, "Oh, I'm going to do this thing where I try to make myself more like my weak spots," focus on the fact that you have things you're good at and get even better at them. So you provide more of a service to other people who need that.
yeah, because it's like jack of all trades, master of none. It's like you've got to find your bread and butter role first before branching out into other things.
Yeah, and that's why not to get off on a whole other tangent, but that's why when he talks about the idealists, the NFs always like trying to find themselves, and they never can find themselves, because if they did, then they wouldn't have anything to seek anymore or whatever. That's the actual act of doing that is what helps other people also.
Right.
Because along the way, it's like all those little self-discovery journeys or whatever provide insight to other people in terms of what they need at that certain time. So that's the thing, is everything's all something or other. I'm not coming up with the good words to say that, but I guess you could say in some ways I'm kind of a fatalist, because I do feel like things sort of fall into place where they're needed.
Right.
But that doesn't mean I necessarily believe in there being like this exact script of life. But I feel like that those things that we don't really have to. That's the difference between me and an NF that would be like, oh, I have to know why all these things are the way. Like, that's the difference, is I don't feel that I have to know why. I just feel like I accept certain things to be true. So, and I guess you could, to bring it back to the Twilight Zone episode, you could say that, different types of people put into this situation would have sought different things, and in this case, he is looking for just a return to normalcy because that's what he wants.
Yeah.
He's enough content in his life, or feels that that's where he's supposed to be, that when he's pulled out of it into this other thing, his entire drive is just getting back to reality, as opposed to either, like I said, trying to have fun with it, or like, intuitive types might have been like trying to figure out more of what's the meaning of this, or what's the scientific reason this is happening, or none of those other things. Like, he's not clouded by any of that in his particular quest, because all he wants to do is get back to reality.
Yeah, and it's as the guy points out in the script, everything you know about yourself, the only things you know about yourself are in this script.
And that's the thing, is that he doesn't specifically say, but we're sort of led to believe that the idea is that if he doesn't get back there before this is entirely destroyed, that he's destroyed along with it. So the fact that he was just entirely driven by that is what ends up saving him, if you believe that to be true. Because if he'd been distracted by any of those other elements, then that wouldn't have been his sole focus.
Yeah, and it gives a sort of shape to the episode, this sort of like countdown thing, where there's a time element in terms of, I've got to get to this place. There's a bit of suspense. Yeah. Will he make it, even if the it is to an imaginary point?
And that's another possibility where, if you had the time and had the ability to do the story and tell it multiple times with different types of people in that spot, if you had somebody more like me, then you say, well, maybe in my case, I never make it back because I have all these other ideas of, well, this is how I'm going to have fun with this thing that I'm now in.
Yeah, because it's like, you mean I'm a rich actor?
Yeah, so that's the other thing. I can't forget to say, what a awful, pretentious-looking house. I was like, I would never want to live in a house like that. Even from the front of it, I'm like, man, I couldn't have ever talked me into living in that place.
But you could have thought, I could sell this for quite a bit, and then use the cash to have fun.
Right, thrown into that situation, yeah, there's all kinds of possibilities.
What a gaudy house, but it might go for quite a bit. Right then, so the bits here about, we'll just send him about the continuous shots.
The other
Yeah,
flaw
go
I
on.
would say is I think the music was a little overdone. The kind of over dramatic music things. Again, it seems a little bit filler in terms of when they didn't have this, didn't want to come up with more dialogue or more action for that scene. It was just like, let's play out the music for 2 more minutes or whatever.
I also think the lead actor could have been better. I mean, the guy J.R. Ewing's boss, who was a better actor in this.
Not J.R. Ewing's boss.
Yeah, whoever the guy was, the Colonel, you know what I mean. The guy who, because he was in I Dream of Jeannie, and I've forgotten the name of Larry Hagman's character. Larry Hagman's boss.
Yeah, it
Fictional.
was Major something? Was it Major Healy or was the other guy?
Yeah.
It was. I think they were both majors, but one of them was Major Healy, and I can't remember the other one.
Yeah.
Major Benson or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's been too long.
But his performance was better than the lead guy, and but I was more intrigued by the idea of it. Just that particular moment at the beginning where it turns round, and that made me think, "Oh wow, where's this going to go?"
I also like the contrast in the wives. They have the more I'll just do the drive-by typing and say the caricature of the artisan actor, the reckless drunken dude with the trophy wife kind of thing, versus the more family manager, as he says from the script, wife that Curtis actually has. So I like the fact they did that.
Yeah,
They have like the money grubbing chick, and then the other one that's very different. So
right. So this is the they talked about a continuous shot when he went into the office, and so yeah, it's a continuous shot from this point onwards, and so we follow him when he gets down there, and then what they then do is they actually physically slide the set very quietly, and then it reveals these people.
yeah, and that's really cool, and the kind of thing they probably wouldn't do now because they would just use editing and stuff like that, and so it's cool that they the old school way of doing that.
And the reason,
and I also another element I liked was having that where his first discovery of this, being out of reality is the fact the phone doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because of course it doesn't work on a movie set. It doesn't need to be a working phone. So I liked that. That's what initiates that whole thing is the phone's dead, or he thinks it is, and so that's why the director has to say cut because the actor wouldn't have done that because he wouldn't have cared whether the phone didn't work.
Right. Let's have a look. Somebody sent me a message over Facebook. Just typos. Right. Okay. Right then. So yeah, I'll read through this. The nature of identity, or who am I? Who I think I am, was a theme of the Twilight Zone and would explore many times. Twilight Zone would explore many times. Of a World of Difference, Richard Matheson says, I like that one. It's one of those Kafka-esque ideas that you get, that a man goes to his office, thinks he's living his normal life, and suddenly finds out that he's an actor on a set. To effect the transition from one reality, the office business as usual, to the other, the soundstage, director Ted Post, whose movie credits include Magnum Force, Hang 'em High, and Beneath the Planet of the Apes, I've seen that one, employed an ingenious visual trick. The scene in the show goes as follows. In one continuous shot, businessman Arthur Curtis enters his office. We see all four walls establishing its solidity and reality. Curtis sits down at his desk and picks up the phone, only to find that the line is dead. Suddenly, he hears someone say cut, and he turns to look in the direction of the voice. The camera follows his gaze to reveal that one wall has disappeared, revealing a soundstage with a full production crew looking on. To accomplish this shot, one wall was built on rails and removed during... Yeah, then I didn't crop this on the scanner. And we've already seen that one. The one that's next in the book, we've already seen. The fever. Because it was one continuous shot, the wall had to move silently, which it did. Book Houghton was totally supportive of this procedure, explaining, if you're going to prove something, it's better to prove it in a continuous shot so that people are really nailed.
Yeah, and the one weakness of that, of course, is that the wall, when they show it, it does look like it's not as solid a wall.
Yeah, it looks like a Japanese place. I thought this is a little Japanese.
So there's already sort of a feeling of this is like a movable thing. So it would have been a little bit more effective if the wall had looked more solid. Maybe if they'd put like, paintings or other stuff, like more things all over it that may, kind of covered up that fact. Maybe that would have been a little more effective. But I still thought it was effective. It just, my thought from the beginning was that it was sort of like a, like a sliding thing.
Yeah, he also
like there was more to the office.
It's also weird is that the actual doors on his office were sliding as well.
Yeah. So I guess you could just say it was the architecture, but But see, we don't. That's the thing that's why Rod Serling has to say, these things exist. He's got to tell you that. So even if you think, there's something fishy here, he's already because if you're watching the show, you have to believe that somebody is telling the truth to you, and that's what Serling's purpose is. Is that he's not gonna lie to you. He's telling you what's happening, even if he gets a little loopy sometimes in some of the things he says. That he's there as the force of connection with the audience to what's happening. So and to me, this episode only works if you accept what he says. Because if you just view it as, if you view it as just this is a character played by this actor that goes a little loopy one day or something, then it's not any better than that episode about the woman who walks into the film.
Yeah.
And the weakness of that one was it didn't have that establishment of that other reality being real. It was just, this is the fantasy, and somehow she's able to develop magic powers to walk into it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen in this one because we've already established that this guy's world is real. So we're not talking about somebody who just randomly walks into a fantasy world at the end. So that's why I thought the ending was much better. Just as last week's ending knocked the story down for me somewhat, this one pulled it up.
I can't even remember last week's episode.
The one with the aliens. I mean, that
was right, yeah.
What the ending was showing them, and I thought that was weak. So
you have the American theatre standards voices.
Yeah. So to me, the ending pulled this one up to. I was going to say 7, but then I thought the strong ending made it an 8. So.
Yeah, I gave it 8 as well. I took it off my. I digitally removed it. That's why it's got that sort of white blob there, where I've sort of removed it. It's hard to see, but yeah, I removed it with GIMP because I wrote in the book that I gave it 8.
Okay.
Mainly because I was so excited by the premise, just that bit where he turns around and there's a film crew there.
Mm-hmm.
And then it lost a little bit after that, but I was very excited by that bit, and that's why I wrote in the chat, oh my god, you got to see this episode. It was just the premise of it. So, jump into conclusions. Yeah, so I think Jeff and I both give it 8 out of 10. And I'll just put on the screen for what Jeff was saying there about how Rod Serling introduced the episode. There, he has flesh and blood, muscle and mind, but in a moment we will see how a thin line separates that which we assume to be real with that manufactured inside of a mind. But you see, that inside of a mind might also talk about the writer. So that bit interests me at the end, where it's like it has on the script something like the private world of the guy. Right. Right, I think we may have lost Jeff. Oh yeah, so we give it 8 out of 10 each. So any other thoughts, Jeff?
Okay, so you can still hear me.
Yes, now I
Join
can
us
hear
next
you.
week for Long Live Walter Jameson.
Okay. Bye bye,
And
folks.
bye-bye.
All right.